Yes.
So, hi everyone. My name is Nicolas Helssen. I work for the European Space Agency in the Business Applications Department. What we're working on is a program which allows companies from all across Europe to actually tap into space data and commercialize applications, products, and services from it. And so what I want to do is give a bit of an overview of what ESA is, perhaps in the first place, and then also what our program does. So we at ESA, we are an intergovernmental organization with 22 different member states. It's a bit different than the European Union or the Commission, which is a more supranational entity. The difference here is that our member states do not relinquish sovereignty to ESA itself. So the member states still have control in most of the optional programs and what we do within the agency. But the agency itself has over 50 years of experience with 8 different sites across Europe. And at the last ministerial at the end of 2022, we secured almost 17 billion for the activities of the upcoming 3 years. So ESA itself is active in many different fields, but in the last decade, I would say there's been a growing focus on the usefulness of downstream applications. So what we mean by downstream is using space data and space technology down on Earth. Upstream is more whatever we put up into space, let's say. It's a bit of a crude but easy way of distinguishing it. And so across those years, multiple programs have kind of come together to offer entrepreneurs one program adapted to their needs, which is called ESA Business Applications and Space Solutions. You might see that these terms will change in the next few years as well. But in overall, the focus is to help space companies, but also mostly non-space companies, to actually use satellite data to develop. So first off, one of the most important websites for companies is actually ESA Star. Now, why is this important? It's because this is the portal through which you have access to all of the publications for calls, so all of the different funding opportunities. It also allows you to open bidder workspaces to do the tendering together or with different consortia. And so you can see the different modules here where you can register, you can go on the tendering one, but also on the top right, you have the information about ESA's procurement process, which is quite interesting because it details the way that ESA works when it tries to procure or buy or pay companies to be involved in different calls, let's say, or programs. Now, in terms of desired outcomes, there's a bit of a triangle that ESA is trying to keep in balance, which is the socioeconomic side. So we are trying to pursue, or at least align with the EU Green Deal, and being sustainable. The second one being the use of space, which of course is important because we are trying to make sure that the utilization of space assets in space is beneficial for user communities on Earth. And then the third one, which is profitability, in a sense, we still have to make sure, since we are working in a global environment, that the companies in Europe are competitive with the different regions on the planet. So business applications itself is focused on these space-enabled services. So the goal is to look at the different space assets, which, as you can see here, might be from Earth observation data, could be navigation data, could be communication data, and then you link it with whatever type of terrestrial technology to create a service or an application for a sector on Earth. And so this slide shows a little bit of the same thing, but in a different way. You can see that if you find Earth observation data, which is useful, and you combine that with some type of AI intelligence, and then you can serve different users and markets on Earth. Now, usually you would start from the left in most of the programs at ESA being technology push directives, but actually in business applications, we like companies to start from the right, to actually start with whatever user needs or whatever challenges there might be on the market, and then that way align it with space technology that can be useful. So it's a bit of a user-driven pull way of doing things, which is a bit new for the agency, let's say. So I want to give a few examples just to make it maybe a bit more concrete about what satellite data can do. And so one example in this case is if we have satellites looking at a city, for instance, there might be a lot of different data. And so here's an example of the eco-stress instrument, which is a thermal radiometer. And you can see that it's a very nice image where we can have the land surface temperature practically at a street level. This is for Milan, where you can see that parks actually have a much nicer and cooler temperature, while the covered food market is very hot, but so are railway lines actually around a train station. But at the end of the day, data is only data, and this might be useful for urban planners. It might be useful for farmers if it's done outside of a city, but you need to create actionable insights from it. Having the data is not enough if you don't know how to use it, if you don't know how to process it, if you don't know how to sell it. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to help companies to kind of see if you have data, be it thermal or be it an optical image such as this, what type of classification measures could you use? What type of AI tricks could you use to actually create actionable output out of this? So in this sense, for instance, it's delineating what is shrubbery, what is a tree, what is grass, all of these different things. You can combine this then with other free data. So this is from Sentinel-5 about air quality, for instance. And you can create products which are very interesting because what they allow you to do is combining all of the different data and then looking at the type of market that it could be useful for, or starting the other way around, is actually quite an interesting way to tackle many different challenges. So here we have, for instance, a picture of rooftops, but if you do a classification of the typology and you look at all of the different roof types that are there, this information can actually be quite useful for home insurance providers because it actually changes some of the premiums that are charged. This is an example of a company which actually did all of this. So they took geospatial data, Copernicus data, satellite data, they mixed it with whatever type of terrestrial data that they could find to basically create a digital twin where they understood exactly for all different types of streets and homes, if there were solar panels, if there were swimming pools. There are some municipalities that charge extra tax for swimming pools, but they need to know where they are. And so this company, in the end, ended up selling this type of information to big utility companies, big banks, financial institutions, the government, postal services, you name it. And it's a good example of using space data, combining it with terrestrial data, and then creating an entire interface API product out of it, which people will pay for, right? And so that's kind of what we're looking for. Another example here, when we're talking about radar data, for instance, is understanding how to use the data or how to process it into your application, even if you may not yet be aware or don't have the expertise to do so. And so an example is, for instance, radar data, because sometimes it's a bit difficult to interpret. A silly example here is about a radar image which shows a train track. And you can see that the train itself seems to be, in the ditch, but that's of course not what happens. It's because of the radar image, the backscatter. Since the train is moving, the image itself actually displaces the train and puts it off of the tracks. But if you're clever, this is quite interesting because it's also a way of looking at ground displacement, at different types of movement. You can, from a radar image, infer what the direction or the range or the speed might be of something. So these are all interesting things to understand. But it might be that a company doesn't have the expertise. They know that there might be something useful for whatever product or whatever service they have, and they know that they want to use this type of data. And what business applications will offer within the feasibility study is the funding and the support to actually hire either manpower within your own company or hire an external consultant to help you figure out how this works and if it's useful for your product. So ESA will pay in this feasibility study the hours that you need to investigate or to learn and to train somebody to actually use this data if you have an inkling that this might be useful for the service that you have. So here's another example as well for radar data, in the fact that it works at night and through clouds. So it's also very interesting for vessel detection because it can work 24/7 despite weather or day and night cycles. Here's another funny example, I would say, of combining this type of imagery with classification tools, where this is actually the parking lot of a Walmart. And based on how many cars are in the parking lot, and this is done automatically, if you do this for many different retail stores, you can actually predict how many cars are in the parking lot. And you can actually also predict, before they publish their financial quarterly results, if their stock is probably going to go up and down. And so this information then can be sold to investors, which is quite an easy way. They call it cheating here, but of course it's not cheating in a sense. It's just using information that's available, applying some technique and a tool to it, and extract something useful out of it. Now, in the 70s, at least in the United States, they used to do this in big cities, but in Cessna planes, so it was much more expensive, but they would actually do this and take pictures of parking lots. The exact same thing. It's just that it's a bit cheaper to do it now. Now, stepping away maybe from Earth observation a little bit, of course, GPS or GNSS, Global Navigation Satellite Systems, are also very interesting, but most people might see them as the ubiquitous technology for navigation in a car, which it is, but it's important to note that GPS at its core is more of a timing instrument rather than a positioning one, or a navigation one. And a lot of different systems that we have today actually depend on it. And so an example of this is ATM machines and the financial transactions here at the New York Stock Exchange. Now, the interesting thing is, at the New York Stock Exchange on the right, practically no trading occurs at all anymore. So most of the trading happens around 6 kilometers away from it in this thing called the Equinix data center. And on top of this data center, you will actually find a whole bunch of GPS antennas, because they're there to time all of the financial transactions to the millisecond, let's say, to make sure that all of this is done in real time. And so there are big fences. You can't spoof these GPS antennas because there's quite some security, just because GNSS and GPS is actually very important to the financial sector. It's the same thing actually for, in every modern power grid, the phase measurement units for the electrical grid, which also have to align very precisely with the atomic clocks in GNSS. So a lot of different things are dependent upon this, and I don't think most people are aware of this. Another interesting example is that GPS, a little bit like the Y2K craze that we had in the year 2000 about Windows rolling back and resetting the time clock, it's kind of the same thing with GPS. It has a reset or a rollover every 19.7 years. And so what happens is that in this case, for instance, Boeing planes suddenly didn't know. It's not that they didn't know where they were, it's that they didn't know when they were. This was in 2019, and Boeings around the world thought that it was 1999. So this wasn't only in China, but it was also KLM, different airliners, and so it caused a bit of hassle, just because sometimes people forget that a lot of their legacy systems were built upon GPS timing. So it was the same for the traffic lights in New York. It was the same for meteorology balloons, monitoring stations, even GoPro drones had this glitch, but also cars. And so this makes you wonder, in a transition towards more automated, connected electric cars, you know, how vulnerable are we really becoming if a lot of these systems are reliant on GPS and on satellite systems? And here also cybersecurity concerns, of course, from it. So this is a bit of a funny meme where you see the entire modern digital infrastructure, and you actually see that GPS is holding everything upright. If we lost it tomorrow, it's not that just our navigation in the car would not work, it's that a lot of things would no longer work. So this was a bit to showcase how these different types of satellite data are useful for many different types of applications. But so what we're trying to do in business applications is we're trying to go from the left to the right, in the sense that, you know, GPS data was available back in the 90s, but the first GPS devices, in this case, the Magellan Nav 1000, I think. So this thing would just give you coordinates to go from A to B. But of course, if you're in a car, you know, it's not very useful. And this Magellan, even back then, cost over $3,000. So it's not something that most people would buy. Around 10 to 15 years later, you had the TomTom, which I think everybody recognizes, which also was a few €100. And, you know, it was a separate thing that you had to purchase. And now, of course, you know, we all have Waze or Google Maps on our phone. So we've had this evolution of commercializing products and services along with technology that has become better. And so building applications, building better products around the satellite data, around the satellite technology is kind of what we're pushing forward. And so within the program itself, even though we fund the integration of the satellite component within your product or your service, what we'll also co-fund is the entire application or the interface or the API or the software that is required to make it commercial. So that means that if you want to integrate geospatial data within an interface, but you need a kind of tool like this, right? An interface where you click on something and it runs some output or whatever, we will also co-fund part of that development. So we will also help the web designer, the software developer, co-fund part of the expenses that are required, be it equipment, be it software licenses, to develop the product. As long as at its core, such as in this example here, you can see that the spatial component or the satellite component is integral or important to the service itself. So that's important. It means that we don't only fund, you know, the downloading of whatever type of data that you might need in the integration, but we also fund the prototype and the product up to a pre-commercial stage. So what we look for in the end is we look for teams. So they have to be established startups or companies that have identified a very specific market opportunity, that have engaged customers, or at least have found users that are willing to write a letter of support for them. And then we offer funding to actually develop and integrate the spatial component within your product or service. And within each company, at least in 9 different countries in Europe, we have ambassadors. So for Portugal, it is Carla, who you saw here in the beginning. So they are your local interface for any questions that you might have about the program. They can advise a bit on the preparation of the proposal or the APQ. They can give you an overview of the different types of funding that might be available. Perhaps if BASS is not yet a fit for you, there might be other ESA programs that are useful. And so for all of these countries, there's always an ambassador present to help you. If you are part of a country that is not in green here, then you can always contact me as well. Here's a bit of an overview of some supported companies. This is not an exhaustive list, but what it does give you is an overview of how we are working with companies in many different types of applications and with many different types of technologies. So that's quite interesting. So it can range from agriculture to maritime to environment to infrastructure. Basically, any market is okay as long as there is a component of spatial or satellite technology that can be incorporated. And here are some quick cases. On the left, you actually see a firefighter wearing a little bit of a device. It's called a shin device, from a company that actually developed a tracking system for emergency response personnel or firefighters, which works indoors as well as outdoors. So of course, there's GNSS, there's a type of communication to it, but it also has accelerometers, pedometers, and whatever you need to actually also figure out where somebody is, for instance, in a burning building. So it's a device that was developed within BASS that really helps the tracking of firefighters, let's say, in whatever type of condition, indoor or outdoor, where they might be. On the right, you can see the little device, which is from a company called Ovinto, which actually puts this type of device, which has GPS, but it also has Globalstar connectivity. And the battery lasts around 5 years, if I remember correctly. And what they do is they actually track the temperature, the pressure, the location of unpowered chemical goods on trains. So this means that if, they have some type of hazardous product within an unpowered tanker, this little device can actually track pressure and all of these things across multiple years without a power source. So if you were to do this with 4G, your battery would be dead after a few days, but with satellite, you can actually make it so that it's much more robust and lasts for much longer. Here is an example of a company that was integrating satellite AIS data for ships, as well as computer vision, as well as connectivity. So creating a type of awareness camera, which could detect vessels, which could actually say when there is a collision about to happen. If, for instance, a bridge is too low that the deck might hit it, all of these type of things. So again, they were combining connectivity with navigation, with computer vision, with AIS data from ships into a coherent product, which was useful for captains on ships. And here, my last example, which is quite an interesting one. This was a company from before COVID who designed an entire software portal as well as a device that could actually slot into aircraft. Now, this wasn't for commercial airliners, but everything below that, beneath that, which allowed pilots to have an electronic flight bag, to see the weather, to see where they were, to communicate, et cetera, et cetera. So it had a lot of different functionalities. But then, of course, COVID hit and they struggled a little bit. But then they realized that their entire device, which had connectivity, which had positioning and all of this, could actually also be very useful for the vaccine transportation and cold chain logistic industry. So they kind of pivoted because they needed to, but they were able to use what they had designed, developed through BASS with satellite connectivity. And the connectivity and positioning aspect of it was actually very useful for other types of products. So they had developed these skills of working with satellite data and space technology, and they were able to pivot much more easily towards a completely different market because they had that capability that they built up within BASS. So this is quite an interesting case to present as well, that this type of thing is possible, right? So as for the funding scheme itself, there's usually two different entry points into the program itself, either by direct negotiation, which is with your own idea. So you come with whatever idea or market or product that you have, or through an invitation to tender. And this is answering a specific call that ESA puts out, for instance, for agriculture, for instance, for logistics. But in both cases, you have feasibility studies that we conduct up to a maximum of 500K. Now, this is different for each country because each country and each delegation might put a different amount of funding into the program. So these numbers might change for your country. So it's always best to check either with your ambassador or with your national delegation to see what the ceilings are for your specific country. But basically, a feasibility study is there to evaluate whether the commercial and technical part is viable. And if it is so, then move on to a demonstration project to actually build the prototype or test the service in an operational environment. The Kickstart studies, which you see there below, this is more focused towards startups. So if you're a younger company or a young startup, or you want to do a smaller feasibility study, then usually the Kickstart studies are the interesting ones to look at. Yeah, okay, this looks a little bit at the maturity. So it's a bit what I was mentioning. Kickstarts is for a bit lower maturity companies, and then the demonstration projects are for companies that are already a bit advanced in what they want to do. It's possible for a company to go straight to a demonstration project and skip the feasibility study if you think that internally you've already done the required work to have a prototype ready. So it's possible to skip these different stages and go straight to a demonstration project. So the roadmap, let's say, when a company applies, is usually they all start with an activity pitch questionnaire. Now, this is for the direct negotiation. So this is for the procedure where you come with your own idea. You submit an activity pitch questionnaire, which is a pitch document of around 7 pages. where you just fill in some questions about who you are, what you want to do, who your customers are, etc. ESA itself will give feedback on this, and if it is acceptable in terms of eligibility, then you are invited to submit an outline proposal, which is a bit of a deeper, in-depth explanation of the work packages that you want to propose. During that time, until you are invited to a full proposal, the full proposal will be the contractual proposal, which also includes the final financial figures. You have the time to actually request from your ambassador the support, either for the part of the proposal to understand what is required. It doesn't mean that the ambassador will write your APQ. I just want to mention that. Otherwise, Carla would have too much work. But it's about explaining what is required, what the questions might mean if there's something that's not clear, but also who the national delegation is, what is this letter of authorization, why do I need it? You know, all of these questions you can also ask your ambassador. And once a full proposal is accepted with the letter of authorization, then we go to a negotiation and a contract signed. So we put tentative weeks down below about how much time this would take. If everything goes perfectly and the company reacts, let's say, very quickly, this could be a bit over 3 months. I think usually it will be a bit closer to 6 months. But this depends as well as on ESA, as well as on the company, and how long the iteration process is of back and forth for the proposals, of course. And so at the end, basically what you get is the zero equity funding from the kickstart up to a few millions, depending on which country you're in, but also your personalized ESA consultant and technical support. So you will be assigned a technical officer at ESA who will oversee your deliverables, how the progress is going, will guide you from here to there or put you in touch with different people. Technical support and personalized consultant does not mean that they are there to do the technical work. It does not mean that they're there to replace whatever technical expertise you might require to operate the service. It just means that it is a helping hand to guide you in the right direction, but the technical officers themselves will not do the work for you. So that's quite important to understand. So here's a few examples of the thematic opportunities. So like I said, if you don't go through a direct negotiation with your own idea, you can also go through the competitive calls, which are here. Usually the co-financing is a bit more favorable to the company. You could have calls that finance 100%, right? Or a bit less. So if you think your idea fits into one of these, or the ones that you would see on the website, of course, then these are usually the more interesting ones to look at. But if you don't find the market or the industry that you're working in, then of course direct negotiation is always an option as well. And I think with this, I would like to leave it. I hope it was interesting to at least understand, first of all, a little bit what we mean by satellite data and what it can do, to also showcase a little bit what the program has already done and how we work. But like I said, if things are still a bit confusing, don't hesitate to reach out. You have my contact details here, or if you know who your local ambassador is, you can also get in touch with them and they will gladly help you forward within the program. Okay, I'll give it back to you, Carla. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, Nicolas, thank you so much. We have already a couple of questions in the chat box. Before I step in with so just an example, I think we can already reply to Ervan and Konstantinos that made some questions. So the first one, Ervan asks is, how does ESA BASS compare with ESA BIC, the incubator?
Yeah, okay. So the ESA BIC is in terms of maturity usually before BASS. So at the ESA BIC, you can apply as an individual team and then basically start your company, let's say. There might be a few changes, but usually it's a bit more early stage for the ESA BIC. The ESA BIC is also focused more on the company. You evaluate the company and what they want to do, whereas in BASS, you evaluate a project or a product that they want to do. So usually what happens is that a company that uses satellite data within the ESA BIC will then follow through to an ESA BASS, because the ESA BASS funding is higher than the ESA BIC. Usually it's not the other way around. So for startups that want to start out with using space data, the ESA BIC would be the first portal to get into, and then they can follow through to an ESA BASS. There are also a few differences in the types of projects that we fund, but I'm not going to go too much into detail. But so the ESA BIC is usually for more early stage companies. I see. What is the driver for the different thematic calls? Okay, so the driver for the different thematic calls, or I'm guessing the question is why do we decide on specific thematic calls? This comes either from the different delegations who have an understanding of the challenges of the markets that are interesting within their own country. It could come from the ambassador who's saying, oh, we have a lot of stuff going on in maritime, and specifically, for instance, for autonomous shipping, whatever. And then ESA says, okay, that's interesting. There's a lot of stuff moving there. Let's propose this in a work plan to our delegates. And then the delegates, a few months later, will decide yes or no on the different thematic calls. And this is how every year we kind of have a list. But this means that companies themselves, if they want to get in touch with their ambassador or with their national delegation, they can also propose things, right? So a company could say, oh, wouldn't it be interesting to have a thematic call on this? Because I see that on the ESA website, it seems that for the last year, there hasn't been a call on this, and we are very interested in this, you know, and then the ball can get pushed through a little bit to ESA. So that's one way of pushing forwards these thematic calls.
We have more questions coming in, which is nice. So Ingi is also for the 5G developments that might be interest, probably questions about the TRL level.
So
maybe other programs.
So 6G indeed. Since we're busy here with applications and services, then it would be mostly 5G, right? Because 6G we're not there yet. If it's related to development of 6G, but on a technical level, so really understanding how to build certain technology yet with a lower TRL level, there's other RTES programs or telecom programs that are perhaps more suitable for this. If it's about building specific services and applications with, you know, commercial customer bases out of it, then of course we can, and integrate it with satellite, of course, then it fits a bit more in business applications. So it really depends on what is and on what we are trying to build, you know, if it's really a technical SATCOM product, or if it's something that doesn't have a customer base, let's say, that will pay for it in the next 2 to 3 years, then usually would not be BASS, and there might be better programs. So, I mean, I guess this is the easiest way to answer this.
Yes, we have another specific question about ESA funding instruments. What are the best ESA funding instruments for a startup that wants to explore application or feasibility on the new cybersecurity technology within university? This is the first one. And then Konstantinos also asks if ESA has any IP rights after the product is finished. And how we deal with this.
So for the first question, if it's a startup, it depends on the maturity a little bit of the startup. If it's related to exploring a cybersecurity technology with a university and it's a startup, my first inkling would be to say that it fits better in the ESA BIC. Regardless of that, let's say that if it's related to cybersecurity and there's a satellite communication component to it, and you have a university that actually wants to do meaningful work for improving the product, then a feasibility under BASS might be interesting as well. Why? And actually, it wasn't one of my slides, but I didn't highlight it. In the feasibility study in BASS, let's say that you are working on cybersecurity technology. But there is one aspect of it which you have difficulty doing yourself, for instance, because you don't have the expertise for some type of antenna development, and you find a university lab or a PhD that has that expertise and it can do it. ESA will pay you 100% of the money so that the university helps you develop that antenna. And so what the university will get is, let's say, 25K to pay the PhD to work on this, to develop for you whatever you require for your antenna. They will then relinquish the IP and the antenna to you, to the commercial company. And this will have been funded by 100%. So that's the interesting thing about BASS, because you wouldn't have that within the ESA BIC. But so again, you could start with the ESA BIC, get 50K for the equipment, for the setting up the startup and doing the initial work for the prototype, and then transfer the project to BASS, let's say, work with the university then, and actually have more money to also pay the university. And then for the IP rights, no, so the IP rights, it's always a bit the same thing. ESA is a bit scary in how they formulate it, but ESA does not own your IP. What they usually do have is they have access to request a quotation to use your IP, which you can always decline with reasonable cause. So this hasn't been an issue. So it means that whatever you develop within an ESA project, either the BIC or the BASS, belongs to you. It's just that if ESA finds it interesting for perhaps one of their missions, they might request access to it, and then it's up to you to negotiate with ESA if you want to do so, and under what conditions. But it's not like they can just take whatever you developed and use it.
We still have one more question. So can you explain, please, Nicolas, the preferred way of supporting documents or support letters? Is there a template? How that works?
Okay. So the support letter for a company could be, they can support you in whatever way they want, but usually what the support letter should include is the company mentioning that the support letter is specific to the ESA feasibility. So sometimes what we see is companies applying and they show a support letter from 2 years ago when some company said, sure, we find you interesting, we'll support you. So that isn't eligible. The support letter has to be specific and dated to a time, let's say at the time of application, mentioning the feasibility study, the specific feasibility study, let's say, that you are applying to. And then it also has to indicate what type of support they grant. The type of support that they grant could just be, we will share with them through telephone or through video call our requirements once a month, right? Could be something like this. That's enough. Honestly, it's enough. If the support letter includes, we will put at their disposal some of our maritime vessels so that they can test their prototype out at sea, blah, 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 that's even better, because that's quite a commitment, you know? So the support letter just has to show that the company is interested in your feasibility study, has to mention specifically that it's for the ESA feasibility study, and then it has to describe what form the support will take. And having a call once a month is also support, right? So that's sufficient. So it's up to you to see what type of cooperation you want to have with the supporting entity.
Nicolas, but the more the merrier, or what?
Yeah.
What can
So
you say?
usually the minimum is 1, but more the better. So if there's more letters of support, usually it gives the delegation as well as ESA a higher reasonable assurance that there is some type of customer validation and some type of interaction with the customers. And it's better to, so customers that would eventually pay is better than, for instance, a stakeholder association, which would not be an end customer. So customer is better. Usually what sometimes happens is that the letter of support might also indicate that in the case that the feasibility study and the demo project are successful and we come to a commercial product, for instance, the customer will get a discount for 12 months of 20% on the operational service, you know, something like this, so that it's kif and that it's a win-win situation in this case. So, but this is up to the company to kind of decide what type of deal they want to strike with their first customers in this sense, right?
Okay, we don't have any more questions in the chat box. I will just share with you an example of a company and the path that the company took here in Portugal with our support from the ESA BASS until demonstrator project. This is Spotlight, a company that started in the ESA BASS in 2017, and they use Earth observation for monitoring critical infrastructures. So using the satellites and capabilities. So they started in the ESA BASS. Actually, the project started, as Nicolas said. There is always this possibility of using a technology, and they started with monitoring archaeological sites. But then, well, there has to be a client, and the clients have to pay, and they pivot the business, and then they apply it to a small arts. Now we call it a Spark for Business, and they start pivoting the business and they start monitoring the road networks. And then they saw, yes, here we have a business, we have clients to pay, and they apply it for a demonstration project in 2022 with the project Spotlight, and now they are monitoring multi-risks for transportation networks using all of these capabilities. Just see if the slides go. My slides don't want to move, which is nice. I will have to change them manually. Sorry for this. And we have tested everything, but when something has to fail, it fails. Let me just share again. Okay. And then, okay. So now they are branded as Spotlight, and they have a couple of pilot applications spread not only from in Portugal, but in Turkey and in Greece, and in Portugal in the railways and also with motorways. And they are partnering with some major players in this area doing this demonstrator, and also with academia institutions. So this gives you an overview of the kind of partners that it is possible to have during these projects. They are now finishing the projects, and I've asked them to state what were the major outputs of the project and the major benefits of having participated in the program. And of course, for the benefits, they say that this possibility of having co-funding of critical R&D activities for developing their solution. Also, this opportunity to go and do the technical and commercial validation of the solution, and establish these key partnerships with major players and go into real world scenarios in different geographies. This is only possible with this kind of big project, a demonstration project that has all this capability, and of course networking and the credibility that comes associated when you are dealing with ESA and everything. So this is just to give you an overview of a company that really made the path, coming from the ESA BASS, growing to the small arts Spark for Business, and then apply it for a demonstrator. And they are now in the last mile of the project, finishing, and they are growing and going in the market with their solution, starting with monitoring archaeological sites, and now to critical infrastructure and specialize it in motorway and railways. I don't know if anyone else has a question. I see someone writing here in the chat box. I wrote, just to tell you, I wrote in the beginning of the chat box the link for the ESA star. I can repeat it again. And I can also put the link for ESA business applications here, and just see if anyone else has a question. I see someone writing. The question doesn't appear yet. Let's just see if the question comes. And meanwhile, I'm putting here the websites. And you can check them. And if you want to know a little bit more about our work here in Portugal, and the question is here.
What is the average winning percentage of BASS? It is usual to pivot based on the feedbacks and then win. So the winning percentage is more applicable, I would say, to the competitive calls. If I take the direct negotiation first, the direct negotiation, where you come with your own idea and the APQ, the ability to update and improve your application based off the feedback loops that you have, means that the success rate is a bit higher, because you have the option to kind of go back and forth with some of the people from ESA. So if you're a bit unsure about the viability or the validity of your application, then the direct negotiation route gives you more support iteratively to get to a better proposal. The competitive calls, you have to submit a full proposal at the start. There's no APQ, there's no outline, all that stuff. For some there are, but usually it's much more direct, and then you are in competition with different countries and different companies. So there the percentage might be a bit lower. But even then, it's very possible that many parallel winners are granted a contract if many parallel applications of good quality are submitted, right? So it's a bit different. The direct negotiation will give you more reassurance of going step by step and then kind of tweaking your proposal. If you go competitively, it's the chances of winning are a bit slimmer. But yeah, that's kind of the balance between the two different ones. Can a company submit more than one proposal? Usually we would refrain from that. So the answer would be no. If you submit a proposal through the APQ and you're in the process, and suddenly you see that there is actually a thematic call that fits your company way better, it is possible to cancel your direct negotiation process and say, oh, sorry, I'd rather go for this thematic call. So this you can do. If you submitted a proposal for a competitive call and you suddenly see another competitive call which you find interesting, usually you would have to wait for the result of the first application before submitting the other one. Since for the competitive call, you would require a letter of authorization from your national delegation, they would probably also see that they have to sign 2 different letters, which means earmarking 2 different big sums of money for you. And so probably at the delegation, it would already be stopped in this case. So usually it's not the case that you submit multiple proposals. I'm not sure if it's technically not allowed, but I think most of the delegations would not approve it.
Yes. So we are just coming to the end of the webinar. I just wanted to make you a final question, Nicolas, something that we get sometimes from the companies that are trying to apply, is the admin work. Is there much admin work involved in management of these kind of proposals? What can you say to the companies? Motivating them.
What a tricky last question, Carla. So there is admin work to be done. And as with all things, the first time you have to do it, it's a little bit of searching. The Kickstart activities that I mentioned for startups have less admin work. Once you go to full proposals and demonstration projects of €500,000, it's a bit more. But even then, the technical officer that you have is the one in charge of explaining to you which type of deliverables and which type of documentation needs to be filled in at what time, so you know in advance. And then it's a matter of, usually what they say is, if you record the work that you do throughout the year anyway, right, in terms of what you've done, where you've spent the money on, and all of this, at the midterm or at the final year review, it's just a matter of putting everything together, right? And after having done a few projects, sometimes it becomes a bit more efficient and a bit more streamlined. But there is a little bit of project management work to be done. But then again, within your work breakdown structure, the management part and the man hours you put into this is also co-funded, right? So it's not completely lost money. There's manpower time that is paid for you to do this as well. So you can consider it as part of the funding that you get to do part of this.